Hello, welcome back to Sky News Real Estate. Well, it can be utterly disappointing and costly for a home buyer. You do months of research, you find a property in your price range and then spend hundreds of dollars getting building and pest and other inspections done. You think you have a chance, but then the property goes for more than the advertised price. Now, if you've been misled about the likely selling price by the agent, then this is a case of underquoting and is under the spotlight at the moment in Victoria and New South Wales. Now, to find out more, we're joined by the President of the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, John Cunningham, and also buyer's agent, Jacque Parker from House Search Australia. Now, this is really interesting, isn't it? Because as of the 1st of January, John, new laws are actually tougher laws and tougher penalties are in place in New South Wales. Can you just explain for us, firstly, what actually is underquoting?
Yeah, it's important to understand what it is because it isn't what a lot of people think it is. Underquoting is when an agent actually quotes a price that is less than their estimated selling price in their agency agreement. That's it, pretty simple. It's not what the property sells for, it's what the agent makes a representation as to the actual likely selling price, which is based on their estimate.
And why is it so bad, Jacque, for consumers, for the potential buyers?
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, buyers are being misled if an agent is doing the wrong thing by underquoting. They're spending all of that money, they're investing themselves emotionally in a property too, and it really builds distrust in the whole industry, which is a real shame because not all agents underquote, obviously. So the new legislation, I think, is going to go a long way in providing clarity and building up trust too between agents and consumers.
Yeah, just how costly can it be? I mean, inspections.
Building and pest inspections are usually around anywhere between $500 to $1,000 depending on the property, but also contract reviews,
yes.
They cost money, and people's time, obviously, and as I said, their emotional investment in the property, all that build up, thinking that they can afford a property that was never going to be in the ballpark in the first place.
Yeah, and John, the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales is actually running information sessions for agents right now. Just exactly what are you telling the agents? I mean, because there's specific terms now that they can't use, aren't there? Like you can't say offers over and that sort of thing.
Exactly. There's a set of guidelines that the Office of Fair Trading have produced, and the Office of Fair Trading are actually going out on those education programs with us to ensure that we're all on the same page. We want agents to understand exactly what they can and can't do. So it's very specific in terms of what you can't do. You can't say offers over, you can't use vagaries, and vagaries was one of the main reasons that this was introduced, that people were saying mid-1 millions or things like that, which was just really too vague for anyone's consideration. So now you can say price guide, you can say bidding guide, you can say price estimate, and you can't quote a price that is less than your estimated selling price, and that range has a maximum range of 10%. So it can't be any less than the lowest figure on your estimated selling price. So that's pretty straightforward, and the program that we're running through for agents is going into the nitty-gritty detail of what is best practice in terms of underquoting.
Okay.
Or avoiding underquoting.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how widespread is this too? I mean, have you come across it very often, Jacque?
Look, I wouldn't say that it's endemic, but I think it's a little bit more widespread than other states, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, because they're capital cities where there's a high demand. But I mean, even agents themselves admit that underquoting has been acceptable and it's been the practice for far too long with a number of agents, and it's something that, as I said before, it's really created no favours between buyers and sellers and agents, and it's a practice that needs to stop.
Yeah. And what about in your view, John? I mean, how widespread?
Look, I think it is a problem, and it has been a problem, and I think you'll find it's certain areas that it's become acceptable and that's not acceptable. And I think also there's two types of things that happen. There's either unconscious incompetence or there's conscious incompetence involved in this. Education is the key. It is everything, and I think the situation that's occurred over the last few years is there's been very little education of agents in this regard from the Fair Trading Department. We want to correct that, and so do they now, and I think these new laws will go a long way to ensuring that happens.
Well, and there's some pretty tough penalties too. I mean, what do agents face?
Yeah, well, it's a $22,000 fine maximum, plus potential loss of the commission from the sale of the property. So the fines will range from $2,200 up to $22,000. So So, and the thing about it is that everything has to be documented now. The estimated selling price is clear. You have to have the evidence to justify that for the seller. You then have to supply any quotation you make on price to the buyer. It's best to actually back that up in writing and record that representation that you've made. So all those things will make it much easier for fair trading to actually pick up on underquoting because it's pretty straightforward now.
Okay. Do you think it goes far enough, Jackie? I mean, do you think perhaps that maybe there should be an independent real estate ombudsman, say, for example?
I think an independent regulator is actually needed. I mean, there's already ombudsmans for industries like the building industry, the finance industry, the banking industry. Real estate is big business in New South Wales, and I think it wouldn't hurt because the Office of Fair Trading, largely for the last 13 years, have been pretty ineffective in handing out fines or prosecuting agents for doing the wrong thing. And I think consumers are jaded. And they realise that more is needed. And I think an independent regulator would be a comfort to consumers knowing that they have someone who is there specifically for the industry in case agents do the wrong thing.
Yeah, what do you think, John? I mean, because obviously the rules are very different and they're being reviewed in Victoria and they're different around the country. Yeah, so I mean, would there perhaps an independent regulator be?
That's the tricky bit. I mean, in terms of it being a nationwide thing, we would love all these things to be actually coordinated on a federal basis, but they're not. Each state has their own idiosyncrasies. Like Victoria's a bit different to New South Wales. South Australia is different again. And then in Queensland, you can't even quote a price with an auction. So for a consumer that's going interstate, it's very confusing. So the reality is we actually do need a single federal law in most of these things. We need a harmonisation of licences and so on. But that has lots of problems because you've got each state legislation and they work very independently from one another. But the Institute's of the view that we need a co-regulation model. So the industry and the regulators together actually forging the reforms. Fortunately, we've got a Minister for Better Regulation and Innovation at the moment who actually has that as part of his agenda to actually forge those reforms for the industry. And this is all about better consumer outcomes because what's best for the consumer is best for the business and that's the way we've got to view it. And I think the future will look better if we go down that cooperative model with the government.
And what about the reserve price? I mean, is that something that should be published in every instance by the...
Oh, look, you know, buyers, and, you know, I'm speaking from a buyer's agent point of view, we would love the reserve price to be published a week before an auction. You know, I think that would go a long way into providing transparency to buyers, knowing that they have the confidence to rock up at an auction, knowing the reserve price. But the trouble is, you know, in the market that we've had too, prices have been rising. You know, it's a different market. I think that we need to come to terms with that. But I think that vendors should also be looking to their agents for advice on, you know, whether or not that's a good tactic to use. I think the important thing is, Bridie, to make sure that underquoted, or that the price that is being quoted is more or less around that reserve price, because there's nothing worse than turning up at an auction with a guide and then the reserve actually turns out to be 100, 200, 300,000 above. That's what buyers are sick and tired of happening, and it's a practice I think that that basically needs to stop and needs to change before buyers have that confidence in the whole real estate industry. So vendors need to take accountability as well, not just agents.
And that's hard, isn't it? Because, John, I mean, obviously the vendor is, you know, it's a stressful time for them. They want the best price possible for their, and they don't perhaps want to say what they're...
No, and I think, look, the vendor is the one that's been forgotten in all this whole equation.
Yeah.
And I think greater consideration should have been given to that. However, under the new laws, it is very clear that an agent cannot quote a price less than the estimated selling price, but also what the other figure is the figure that the owner instructs them to sell the property at. So there is consideration given there, and Australian consumer law has some very specific details on what you can and can't do. And I think a lot of agents and consumers aren't aware of that element involved. But the reality is, in most cases, agents are not setting reserves with vendors until a day or two before the auction. It's such a fluid thing. It's so subjective in terms of determining what a value is for a seller and for a buyer. So for the transparency, and I know in my career as a real estate agent, I looked at it like a jigsaw puzzle. I was putting the pieces together and getting the picture clearer for my sellers and my buyers as we progressed through the campaign, updating my buyers when we got towards the auction what the likely outcome will be. So they went to auctions clearly understanding what is most likely going to happen. That's professional practice. That's best practice, and we'd love the industry to go that way. But unfortunately, the industry is so poorly educated because the government allows people to become real estate agents with virtually no training. You can do that within 2 days.
All right, just finally to wrap it all up, Jackie, just quickly, what's your advice to advise? What do they need to do to avoid being caught with this?
They need to ask 4 questions when they go to a property. They need to ask the agent what is the estimated selling price on this property. If the agent doesn't want to tell them or the vendor's instructions are not to disclose the price, then at least ask what does the vendor want and what are the most similar comparable properties they use to price this property. I think they're really important questions that every buyer needs to ask.
And John, just quickly, for agents, for the vendors, what's the key tip here?
The key tip is to ensure that you understand what transparency is about, and that the fact that the consumer's not a fool. Consumers want clarity, they want guidance, and that's a reality. They want to deal with a trusted advisor. So for a seller to understand what the agent's obligations are, 1. 2, to understand that the price is fluid and not to get too fixated on what you think your property is worth up front. Let the market give you the feedback. Go through that process, because vendors can often be their own worst enemy, and it's important to listen to the market and listen to their professional agent.
John Cunningham from the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, President, thank you so much for that. And of course, Jacque Parker from House Search Australia.
My pleasure. Thank you, Bridie.
Thank you both for joining us this
Bridie.
morning. Well, coming up after the